They laughed at the old woman before they ever learned her name. The sound spread across the grand ballroom like spilled champagne, sharp and careless beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers worth more than most families earned in a year. Eleanor Brooks froze near the center of the marble floor, her trembling hands clutching a silver tray of champagne glasses as dozens of wealthy guests turned toward her with amusement shining in their eyes. At 72 years old, Eleanor had spent her life cleaning floors, washing dishes, and surviving quietly in a city that barely noticed women like her. Tonight, she stood inside the Whitmore Foundation charity gala, surrounded by diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and people who measured human worth by the labels stitched inside a jacket. Her simple navy dress looked painfully out of place beneath the golden lights of the Manhattan Hotel ballroom. The hem had been carefully repaired by hand 3 different times. Her shoes were polished but worn thin at the soles, and covering her fragile hands were the same white gloves she had worn every single day for nearly 30 years. "Careful, Grandma." A man chuckled as Eleanor accidentally brushed his sleeve while trying to move through the crowd. Nervous laughter followed. Eleanor lowered her eyes immediately. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered softly, her southern accent still clinging to her words despite decades in New York. She tried to continue walking. But then it happened. One guest stepped backward without looking. His shoulder slammed lightly into the tray in Eleanor's hands, and a crystal glass tipped sideways. Champagne splashed across the front of Vanessa Whitmore's silver designer gown. The room went dead silent for exactly 1 second. Then Vanessa slowly looked down at the stains spreading across her dress. Her face twisted in disbelief. "Oh my God," she hissed, stepping back sharply. "Are you serious right now?" Eleanor's face drained of color. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to." Vanessa interrupted loudly. "This dress costs more than your entire apartment." A few guests laughed nervously, but Vanessa wasn't finished. Embarrassment had already turned into cruelty. "Who even let her in here?" she snapped, glaring openly at Eleanor now. "She looks like she wandered in off the street." More laughter echoed through the ballroom. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the tray so hard her knuckles shook beneath the white gloves. She bent down immediately, reaching for a napkin to wipe the stain from Vanessa's dress. But the younger woman stepped back dramatically as though Eleanor's touch itself offended her. Phones slowly began appearing in people's hands. Someone whispered, "This is unbelievable." Another guest quietly started recording. Eleanor could feel every eye in the room pressing against her skin. Heat flooded her face. Humiliation settled heavy in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Please forgive me, ma'am." Vanessa folded her arms. "You people always say that after ruining something." The words landed harder than the champagne ever could. Around them, nobody stepped in. Nobody defended the old woman standing alone beneath the chandeliers, while wealthy strangers watched her unravel in silence. And high above the ballroom, on the second-floor balcony overlooking the gala, a man in a perfectly tailored black suit slowly lowered the glass of whiskey in his hand. Vincent Moretti had been preparing to leave the event without speaking to anyone. But now his cold blue eyes remained fixed on Eleanor Brooks and the white gloves trembling on her hands. Something about them had stopped him completely. The laughter downstairs continued for another few seconds. Then Vincent Moretti started walking toward the staircase. The laughter did not stop when Vincent Moretti reached the bottom of the staircase. It only grew quieter, thinner, uncertain now, as if the room itself sensed something shifting beneath the polished surface of the gala. Eleanor Brooks remained bent slightly forward near the center of the ballroom, still clutching the silver tray against her chest, while Vanessa Whitmore examined the stain on her designer gown like it was a personal tragedy. Around them, wealthy guests whispered behind champagne glasses and glowing phone screens, hungry for humiliation the way some people hungered for dessert. Eleanor had seen that look before. She had seen it on subway platforms when people avoided sitting beside her worn coat. She had seen it at grocery stores when cashiers counted her wrinkled bills twice. She had seen it during 40 years of cleaning apartments where rich families trusted her to scrub their bathrooms but never invited her to sit at their tables. Shame was not new to Eleanor Brooks, but tonight felt different. Tonight the humiliation was louder, public, decorative, like entertainment. She slowly lowered herself to one knee, ignoring the ache in her joints, and reached for the cloth napkin lying near Vanessa's heels. The white gloves covering Eleanor's hands were old now, soft with age. The fingertips faded from decades of washing dishes and kneading bread dough long before arthritis twisted her fingers. She wore them everywhere: summer heat, winter snow, church on Sundays, grocery stores on Mondays. Even now, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Manhattan's wealthiest charity gala, the gloves remained perfectly clean despite everything else about her appearing worn by life. Vanessa noticed them too. "What is with those gloves?" she asked loudly, laughing as she looked around at the crowd for support. "You look like you are auditioning for some old movie." A few guests chuckled immediately. One man raised his phone higher to capture Eleanor's face. "Maybe they are worth more than the dress." Another woman joked under her breath. More laughter followed. Eleanor kept her eyes lowered. "They belong to my mother," she said quietly. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Well, maybe your mother should have taught you how not to ruin a $10,000 gown." The words struck harder this time because Eleanor knew everyone around her agreed. Nobody defended old women who arrived alone. Nobody interrupted wealthy people when cruelty sounded entertaining. Near the ballroom entrance, waiters stood frozen with silver trays in their hands, unsure whether to intervene. The violinists continued playing softly in the background, though the music now sounded strange beneath the tension spreading across the room. Eleanor finally managed to wipe the champagne droplets from the marble floor and carefully rose back to her feet, her knees trembling slightly beneath her navy dress. "I said I am sorry," she whispered again. But Vanessa stepped closer instead, lowering her voice into something colder. "People like you are always sorry after making a mess." Eleanor inhaled sharply at the words, not because they were new, because they were familiar, the kind of sentence people used when they no longer saw a human being standing in front of them. High above the ballroom, the balcony now stood empty. Vincent Moretti was no longer watching from a distance. He moved silently through the crowd in his black tailored suit, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. Guests instinctively stepped aside without understanding why. Some recognized him immediately and lowered their voices. Others only noticed the bodyguards appearing quietly near the walls like shadows. But Vincent was not looking at the crowd. His cold blue eyes remained fixed on Eleanor Brooks and those faded white gloves. Because 30 years ago, in a freezing Brooklyn winter, a starving 12-year-old boy had once seen those exact gloves place warm bread into his shaking hands. The moment Vincent Moretti stepped fully into the center of the ballroom, the atmosphere changed so completely that even the violinists stopped playing without realizing it. Conversations died in half-finished whispers. Crystal glasses froze halfway to painted lips. The same guests who had laughed only seconds earlier now lowered their eyes or quietly slipped their phones back into designer purses. Fear moved through wealthy people differently than shame did. Shame made them louder. Fear made them silent. Eleanor Brooks still stood near the marble column, clutching the silver tray against her chest, unaware that the most powerful man in the room was now only a few feet away from her. She kept her eyes lowered, trying to disappear the same way she had learned to disappear her entire life. But Vincent could not stop staring at those gloves. The memory had returned too clearly now. Brooklyn, winter of 1994. Snow leaking through broken apartment windows. An exhausted woman coughing beneath thin blankets, while a hungry 12-year-old boy wandered the streets pretending he was not afraid. Vincent remembered the smell of bakery bread drifting through the freezing air. He remembered standing outside the small church kitchen on Fulton Street, too ashamed to ask for food. And he remembered a pair of white gloves placing warm bread rolls into his shaking hands, while a soft southern voice whispered, No child should ever feel hungry. He had never forgotten that voice. Vanessa Whitmore finally noticed the silence spreading through the ballroom and turned around with a practiced smile already forming on her face. "Mr. Moretti," she said quickly, smoothing her silver gown. "I was just dealing with a little accident." Vincent did not answer. His expression remained unreadable as he walked directly past her and stopped in front of Eleanor instead. The old woman looked up slowly, confusion flickering across her tired eyes as she realized who stood before her. Up close, Vincent Moretti looked even more intimidating than the newspapers described. 6'3", broad shoulders beneath a perfectly fitted black suit, cold blue eyes sharp enough to silence entire rooms without effort. Yet when he looked at Eleanor, something softer hid beneath the steel. "Where did you get those gloves?" he asked quietly. His voice was calm, but the question carried through the silent ballroom like a church bell. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "These?" She looked down at her hands. "They belong to my mother." Vincent swallowed slowly. Nearby, Vanessa forced an awkward laugh. "Honestly?" "Vincent, she spilled champagne everywhere. We were only joking around." He still did not look at her. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention gathering around them. "I can pay for the cleaning," she offered softly. "It may take me some time, but I promise I will." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances at those words. Nobody had expected dignity from the woman they had mocked. Nobody had expected grace. Vincent's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor Brooks." The tray nearly slipped from her trembling hands as Vincent repeated the name quietly to himself. Eleanor Brooks. After all these years, around them. Guests watched with growing confusion while whispers spread rapidly through the ballroom. Nobody understood why Vincent Moretti looked shaken by an elderly woman in worn shoes and white gloves. Nobody understood why his bodyguards now stood rigid near the walls like soldiers awaiting orders. Vanessa crossed her arms impatiently. "Mr. Moretti, surely this is not necessary." She embarrassed herself enough already. That was the moment Vincent finally turned toward her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly beneath the weight of his stare. Vanessa's confident smile faltered for the first time that night, and then, in front of every wealthy guest in the ballroom, Vincent Moretti slowly reached for the silver tray in Eleanor's shaking hands and set it gently aside before saying words that made the entire room freeze in shock. "This woman once kept me alive." The silence after Vincent Moretti's words felt heavier than the marble walls surrounding the ballroom. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody moved. The old woman standing beside him looked completely stunned, her trembling fingers tightening against the fabric of her navy dress as if she no longer trusted her own balance. Around them, Manhattan's wealthiest guests stared in disbelief, trying to understand how a woman they had mocked only moments earlier could possibly matter to a man like Vincent Moretti. Vanessa Whitmore blinked several times before forcing another nervous smile. "I think there has been some misunderstanding," she said carefully. "Surely you do not mean I mean exactly what I said." Vincent's voice remained calm, but it carried the kind of authority that silenced arguments before they began. He turned slowly toward Eleanor again, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Time had changed her. The woman who once worked inside the small Brooklyn church kitchen had older eyes now, softer shoulders, grey curls replacing dark hair. But kindness still lived inside her expression. That had not changed at all. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I am sorry, sir, but I think you may have mistaken me for someone else." Vincent shook his head once. "No." The single word landed softly between them. "I remember your voice." Eleanor stared at him in confusion, while fragments of memory slowly surfaced beneath the exhaustion in her eyes. Brooklyn winters. Hungry children lining up near the church basement. A quiet boy with bruised knuckles and guarded eyes who never spoke much but always said, "Thank you." Vincent glanced briefly toward the ballroom windows where rain now streaked against the Manhattan skyline. "You worked at St. Gabriel's Shelter on Fulton Street," he said quietly. "You used to stay after closing because some kids were too afraid to leave hungry." Eleanor's lips parted slightly. The room listened in absolute silence now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. "You gave extra bread to a boy who kept pretending he was not cold." Vincent's jaw tightened faintly as the memory sharpened inside him. "Every Friday night you wrapped leftovers in newspaper so he could take food home to his mother." Eleanor's breathing became uneven. "Vincent," she whispered at last. It was the first time anyone in that ballroom had ever spoken the Mafia Boss's first name aloud. A ripple of shock moved instantly through the guests, but Vincent only nodded slowly. "You remember?" Eleanor lifted one shaking hand to her mouth. Tears gathered in her tired eyes almost immediately. "Lord have mercy," she whispered softly. Little Vincent. Nobody in the ballroom understood what they were witnessing. To them, Vincent Moretti existed only as headlines and whispered rumors. Power, wealth, fear. Men like him were not supposed to have histories involving church shelters and hunger. But Eleanor remembered now. She remembered the skinny 12-year-old boy who used to sit quietly near the radiator while his sick mother slept upstairs in a freezing apartment. She remembered slipping him extra soup because he always claimed he had already eaten. She remembered those sharp blue eyes that never trusted kindness completely. Vanessa laughed weakly beside them, desperate to regain control of the room. "This is very touching, truly, but we cannot ignore what happened here tonight." Vincent finally looked at her again. The softness disappeared instantly from his expression. "What happened here tonight," he said quietly, "is that a room full of privileged strangers mocked the woman who fed hungry children when nobody else cared whether they survived." Vanessa's face lost color. Several guests immediately lowered their eyes in shame. One woman quietly stopped recording and slid her phone into her purse. Eleanor shook her head gently through tears. "I never wanted attention," she whispered. Vincent looked at her for a long moment before answering in a voice so quiet the room leaned closer to hear it. "That is exactly why you deserve it." Rain pressed softly against the towering ballroom windows while nobody dared speak above a whisper anymore. The charity gala that had once overflowed with laughter and champagne now felt strangely small beneath the weight of Vincent Moretti's words. Eleanor Brooks stood motionless beside him. Her tired eyes shining with tears, she kept trying to blink away. She had spent most of her life unnoticed. Invisible women did not expect rooms full of millionaires to suddenly stare at them with respect. Yet that was exactly what was happening now. Guests who had laughed only minutes earlier could no longer meet her eyes. Vanessa Whitmore shifted uncomfortably beneath the silence spreading around her. "Vincent," she said carefully, trying to regain control of the evening. "I understand this woman helped you once, but surely you are overreacting." Vincent slowly turned toward her. There was no anger in his face now. Somehow that made him more intimidating. "Do you know what hunger sounds like?" "Vanessa," he asked quietly. She blinked in confusion. "Excuse me." Vincent glanced briefly toward Eleanor before answering. "It sounds like a mother pretending she already ate so her child will not feel guilty taking the last piece of bread." The ballroom remained completely still. It sounds like a 12-year-old boy lying awake all night because the apartment heat stopped working in December. His blue eyes hardened slightly. And sometimes it sounds like pride. The kind that keeps people from asking for help even when they are starving. Vanessa folded her arms defensively. "I did not know any of that." "No," Vincent replied softly. "You only knew her shoes were old." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Across the ballroom, several guests quietly lowered their heads. One elderly man removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes in visible shame. Eleanor swallowed painfully. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered. "Please, this is too much attention." Vincent looked at her again, and something inside his expression softened in a way almost nobody in that city had ever witnessed. "When I was 12 years old," he said carefully, "my mother collapsed during a snowstorm 2 blocks from St. Gabriel's shelter." Eleanor's breathing caught instantly. Vincent continued quietly, his voice calm enough that the entire ballroom leaned closer to hear him. "Nobody stopped to help us. People crossed the street to avoid us. I still remember that night because my mother kept apologizing for being cold." Eleanor covered her mouth with one trembling hand. She remembered now. The exhausted young woman wrapped in a thin coat. The frightened boy standing beside her, pretending not to cry. "You brought us inside," Vincent said. "You made soup from whatever scraps were left in the kitchen. You wrapped bread in newspaper so my mother could take food home the next morning without feeling ashamed." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. "You remembered that," she whispered. Vincent gave the smallest nod. "I remember every person who treated us like human beings before I had money." The room fell even quieter somehow. Nearby, the hotel staff stood frozen beside silver serving carts while rain continued sliding down the glass skyline behind them. Vanessa's confident posture had disappeared completely now. "I was only joking," she muttered weakly. Vincent's gaze moved toward her again. Cruelty always sounds like joking to the person causing it. Nobody defended her this time. Nobody laughed. Eleanor looked overwhelmed by everything happening around her. "I did not come here for this," she said softly. "I only wanted to support the children's fundraiser." Vincent glanced toward the donation table near the ballroom stage where a small envelope still sat beside Eleanor's handwritten name. One of his bodyguards quietly stepped forward and handed him the envelope. Vincent opened it slowly. Inside was a personal check for $300. Several guests exchanged stunned looks immediately. To most people in that ballroom, $300 meant almost nothing. But Vincent understood sacrifice when he saw it. He looked back at Eleanor carefully. "How long did it take you to save this?" Eleanor hesitated before answering with embarrassed honesty, "About 8 months." And for the second time that night, the entire ballroom went silent in shame. 8 months. The number settled over the ballroom, heavier than any speech delivered that night. Eleanor Brooks lowered her eyes the moment the words left her mouth, almost embarrassed by the truth. She had not intended anyone to know how long it took her to save $300. In a room where women carried handbags worth 5 figures and men casually discussed million-dollar investments beside crystal champagne towers, her sacrifice suddenly looked painfully small. But Vincent Moretti understood exactly what that number meant. 8 months of skipped bus rides, 8 months of buying canned soup instead of fresh groceries, 8 months of quietly sacrificing comfort so children she would never meet could have winter coats and school lunches. He stared at the check in silence for several long seconds before carefully folding it and slipping it back into the envelope like it was something priceless. "You saved for 8 months," he repeated quietly. Eleanor nodded once. "Children should not have to feel hungry," she whispered. The irony of the sentence nearly broke the room apart. Several guests visibly looked away, because only moments earlier, many of them had laughed at the very woman who understood hunger better than anyone standing there. Vanessa Whitmore shifted awkwardly near the ballroom bar, her face pale beneath layers of expensive makeup. "This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic," she muttered softly. Vincent turned toward her slowly. "Do you know what dramatic is?" he asked. Nobody answered. Rain continued tapping softly against the towering windows while the ballroom remained suspended inside a silence that no orchestra could repair. Vincent took a slow step toward Vanessa, though his voice never rose. Dramatic is a 72-year-old woman spending 8 months saving money for children while people worth millions laugh at her shoes. Vanessa swallowed hard. "I said I was sorry." Vincent studied her expression carefully, and for the first time all night, genuine disappointment crossed his face. "No," he said quietly. "You were embarrassed. That is not the same thing." The words hit with brutal honesty precisely because they were true. Around the ballroom, guests who once admired Vanessa's confidence now avoided standing near her. One woman quietly removed herself from the group entirely. Another lowered her champagne glass untouched onto a nearby tray. Shame spreads quickly when powerful people stop protecting cruelty. Eleanor gently stepped forward before the silence could grow sharper. "Please," she said softly to Vincent, "I do not want trouble for anyone." He looked at her almost incredulously. Even now, even after everything, she still worried more about peace than pride. Vincent exhaled slowly and glanced toward the ballroom stage where the foundation's golden donation board displayed the names of major sponsors in glowing letters. Whitmore Industries occupied the center position beneath a $5 million pledge announced earlier that evening with applause and camera flashes. Vincent looked at the board for several long seconds before calmly removing his cufflinks one at a time. The simple movement immediately changed the atmosphere again. His bodyguards straightened near the walls. The event organizers exchanged nervous looks, because everyone in New York understood one dangerous truth about Vincent Moretti. The quieter he became, the more serious the situation truly was. He handed the cufflinks to one of his security men before speaking without emotion. "Cancel my donation." Gasps spread instantly across the ballroom. Several foundation directors nearly stopped breathing. Vanessa blinked in complete shock. What Vincent never looked away from the donation board. Every dollar. One organizer hurried forward nervously. "Mr. Moretti, perhaps we can discuss this privately." "No." His calm voice cut through the ballroom like cold steel. Tonight this foundation publicly humiliated the only person in this room who understands what charity actually means. Eleanor's eyes widened in alarm. "Vincent, please do not do this because of me." Slowly, Vincent turned back toward her, and for the first time all night, his expression softened into something almost painfully human. "I am doing it because of who you are." Then he looked toward the stunned crowd surrounding them and delivered the sentence nobody in that ballroom would ever forget. "Money impresses people. Sacrifice reveals them." The ballroom remained frozen long after Vincent Moretti spoke those words. Money impresses people. Sacrifice reveals them. Nobody reached for another champagne glass after that. Nobody laughed. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala had transformed completely, as though the chandeliers themselves had dimmed beneath the weight of shame hanging over the room. Eleanor Brooks stood quietly beside Vincent, still overwhelmed by the attention surrounding her. She had spent decades believing kindness disappeared the moment wealth entered a room. Yet now the most feared man in New York stood beside her like a shield, while some of the city's richest people avoided looking directly at her face. Across the ballroom, foundation directors whispered urgently among themselves near the stage. Panic spread quickly whenever large donations disappeared. $5 million was not just charity, it was influence, reputation, press coverage. And Vincent Moretti had just withdrawn all of it with one calm sentence. Vanessa Whitmore stared in disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said finally, her voice cracking beneath the pressure. "You are willing to damage an entire charity event over one misunderstanding." Vincent looked at her without emotion. "No," he answered quietly. "I am willing to expose what kind of people were hiding inside it." Several guests visibly flinched at the sentence. One older businessman loosened his tie uncomfortably, while another woman quietly slipped toward the exit, unable to endure the tension any longer. Eleanor gently touched Vincent's sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "The children should not suffer because of this." Vincent's expression softened immediately when he looked down at her. "And that," he said quietly enough for only nearby guests to hear, "is why you are nothing like them." Eleanor lowered her eyes again. Embarrassed by praise, she clearly did not know how to receive. The ballroom doors suddenly opened as additional reporters entered from the lobby downstairs. Word had already spread through the hotel. Something unusual was happening at the Whitmore Gala. Camera flashes began flickering near the entrance, while nervous event coordinators rushed forward trying to control the situation before the story reached the morning headlines. But it was already too late. Because several guests who had mocked Eleanor earlier now found cameras turning toward them instead. Public cruelty always feels entertaining until the spotlight changes direction. Vanessa noticed it too. Panic flashed across her face as one reporter lifted a camera toward her stained silver gown. "This is ridiculous," she snapped sharply. "That woman embarrassed herself. Everyone here saw it." Vincent slowly turned toward the crowd surrounding them. "Did she?" he asked calmly. Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. He stepped away from Eleanor then, walking toward the ballroom stage while every eye followed him. The foundation director hurried nervously beside him. "Mr. Moretti, perhaps we can salvage this privately. The press does not need to know about tonight." Vincent climbed the stage steps without responding. The glowing donation board still displayed Whitmore Industries at the center beneath golden lights. He stared at it briefly before taking the microphone from the stunned announcer. The feedback hum echoed through the silent ballroom. "Tonight," Vincent said calmly, "I watched a 72-year-old woman donate 8 months of sacrifice while people worth millions mocked her because she looked poor. No music played now, no glasses clinked. Only his voice moved through the room. Some of you applauded $5 million checks tonight because they looked impressive on camera." He glanced toward Eleanor, standing quietly near the marble column. But the smallest donation in this ballroom required the greatest sacrifice. Several guests lowered their heads immediately. One woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes. Vincent looked toward the donation board one final time before speaking again. "Remove Whitmore Industries from the sponsor wall." Gasps spread instantly. Vanessa stepped forward in complete disbelief. "You cannot do that." Vincent met her stare calmly. "Watch me." Then he handed the microphone back to the announcer and delivered one final sentence that silenced the ballroom more completely than fear ever could. "Respect is not proven by how people treat the powerful. It is revealed by how they treat someone who can offer them nothing in return." For several long seconds after Vincent Moretti stepped away from the stage, nobody in the ballroom moved at all. The silence no longer felt tense now. It felt reflective, like hundreds of wealthy strangers had suddenly been forced to see themselves clearly beneath the gold chandeliers and polished marble floors. Vanessa Whitmore stood frozen near the sponsor wall while technicians quietly removed her company's glowing name from the center display. Every camera in the room captured it. Every whispered conversation shifted direction. The woman who had entered the gala expecting admiration now stood completely alone inside a room that no longer wanted to stand beside her. Eleanor Brooks watched the entire scene with visible discomfort. Her tired eyes moved anxiously between Vincent and the embarrassed guests surrounding them. "Please stop this," she whispered softly. "I never wanted anyone humiliated because of me." Vincent looked at her carefully, almost sadly. "That is because kindness never enjoys humiliation," he said. "Cruelty does." The words settled quietly into the room. Nearby, one of the younger waitresses suddenly stepped forward, carrying a chair from one of the VIP tables. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it beside Eleanor. "Ma'am," she said softly, "would you please sit down?" Eleanor looked startled by the kindness. "Oh no, honey, I am all right." But the young waitress smiled through tears gathering in her eyes. "Please." Slowly, Eleanor allowed herself to sit while the entire ballroom watched. The same people who had laughed at her less than an hour earlier now looked ashamed they had never truly seen her at all. Vincent remained beside her, standing quietly with his hands folded in front of him while reporters continued gathering near the ballroom entrance. Camera flashes reflected softly against the rain-covered windows. One reporter finally stepped forward carefully. "Mr. Moretti," she asked, "why did this affect you so personally?" Vincent did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Eleanor's worn white gloves resting gently in her lap. Because when society ignores kindness, he said quietly, people stop believing goodness matters. The room fell silent again. Eleanor looked down at her gloves, embarrassed by the attention. I only did what anybody should do, she whispered. Vincent shook his head faintly. No, he replied. You did what very few people actually choose to do when it costs them something. Across the ballroom, several guests now approached the donation table quietly. One couple increased their pledge without speaking to the cameras. Another businessman removed his expensive watch and asked the foundation to auction it immediately for the Children's Shelter Fund. The atmosphere had changed completely, not because of fear, because guilt had turned into reflection. People suddenly wanted to deserve the charity event they had attended. The foundation director approached Eleanor nervously carrying a crystal plaque originally meant for the evening's largest corporate sponsor. Mrs. Brooks, he said awkwardly, the board would like to recognize your contribution tonight. Eleanor looked horrified. Oh no, sir, please, I do not need awards. But Vincent gently accepted the plaque first before kneeling slightly beside her chair so their eyes met equally. The movement stunned the ballroom all over again. Powerful men rarely lowered themselves for anyone. You are not being honored for money, Vincent said softly. You are being honored because sacrifice deserves to be seen. Eleanor's eyes filled again immediately. Her voice trembled when she answered, Nobody has ever spoken to me like that before. Vincent's expression tightened faintly, almost as if those words hurt him more than anything else said that night. Around them, the ballroom remained completely still. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, because suddenly this was no longer about scandal or donations or social status. It was about dignity, the kind that survives decades of hardship without becoming bitter, the kind that still chooses kindness after life gives every reason not to. Vincent carefully placed the crystal plaque into Eleanor's trembling hands. Then, before anyone could speak again, one elderly man near the back of the ballroom slowly began to applaud. The sound echoed softly through the silence. Another guest joined him, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom stood together, applauding the old woman in worn shoes and faded white gloves, while tears slipped quietly down Eleanor Brooks's face. The applause continued long after Eleanor Brooks lowered her tearful face into her trembling hands. It was not the loud applause people gave at expensive galas after polished speeches and carefully rehearsed performances. This sounded different. Slower, heavier, honest, one by one. The guests who had ignored her earlier now stood quietly around the ballroom with expressions marked by regret rather than status. Some clapped softly. Others simply watched the elderly woman in worn shoes and white gloves with eyes full of shame. Eleanor kept shaking her head gently as if she still could not understand why any of this was happening to her. Please, she whispered through tears, I am not special. Vincent Moretti stood beside her chair in silence for several seconds before answering. That is what truly special people usually believe. The sentence settled softly across the ballroom. Nearby, reporters continued documenting every moment, but even they seemed quieter now, careful not to interrupt something that no longer felt like entertainment. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan glowed beneath cold rain and silver streetlights, while the storm slowly softened over the city. Inside the ballroom, however, something far more unusual had changed. People were listening to each other differently, looking at each other differently. One of the foundation board members approached Eleanor carrying a folded navy umbrella and her small donation envelope. Mrs. Brooks, he said gently, the Children's Shelter would like to name the winter meal program after you. Eleanor looked completely stunned. Oh no, she said immediately. Please do not put my name on anything. Vincent smiled faintly beside her. You still do not understand what you gave people tonight? Eleanor looked up at him through wet eyes. I only brought $300. No, Vincent answered softly. You brought integrity into a room full of performance. The ballroom grew quiet again. Vanessa Whitmore was nowhere to be seen now. Sometime during the applause, she had quietly slipped out through a side exit while cameras followed other stories instead. Her absence barely mattered anymore. The night no longer belonged to humiliation. It belonged to restoration. Vincent glanced toward one of his bodyguards and gave a small nod. Moments later, a black cashmere coat was brought forward and carefully placed around Eleanor's shoulders. She immediately protested, "Oh no, sir, this looks expensive." "It is raining," Vincent replied simply. The old woman smiled weakly through tears while gently touching the coat sleeve like she was afraid to damage it. Together, they slowly walked toward the ballroom entrance while guests instinctively stepped aside to make room for them. Not out of fear this time, out of respect. Several people quietly thanked Eleanor as she passed. One young woman stopped crying long enough to whisper, "I hope I become half the person you are someday." Eleanor looked overwhelmed by every word. At the hotel entrance, the rain had softened into a light mist drifting across the glowing Manhattan streets. Vincent's driver opened the back door of a black town car while cameras remained respectfully distant near the lobby. Eleanor paused before entering the car and looked back at Vincent. "Your mother," she said softly. "Did she ever get better?" For the first time that night, real sadness crossed Vincent's face. She passed away 3 years later. Eleanor lowered her eyes sadly. "I am so sorry, sweetheart." Sweetheart. The word froze several nearby reporters in place. Nobody else in New York would have dared speak to Vincent Moretti that way, but he only nodded quietly, like for one brief moment he was not the feared man from newspaper headlines anymore, just the hungry boy from Brooklyn again. Eleanor gently touched his hand. "She would be proud of you." Vincent looked away toward the rain-covered streets for a long moment before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight, I hope she would be proud of you too." Eleanor smiled through tears and slowly entered the car. As the vehicle disappeared into the glowing Manhattan night, the ballroom behind them remained silent, because somewhere between the laughter, the shame, and the rain against the windows, an entire room full of powerful people had finally remembered what dignity looks like.